Attachment. Number 1, infant caregiver interactions. Attachment is defined as an emotional and reciprocal bond between two people, usually being a caregiver and an infant. Responses from non-verbal communications can help determine the strength of an attachment. This can be established in several ways. Interactional synchrony is when a caregiver and infant mirror one another's facial expressions and body movements, and this can help to reinforce an attachment bond. Reciprocity is a description of how two people interact. Mother-infant interaction is reciprocal in that both infant and mother respond to each other's signals and each elicits a response from the other. There are also other factors which contribute to strengthening an attachment, such as bodily contact. In particular, the period immediately after birth. Evidence to support this comes from Meltzoff and Moore. They studied infants aged 2 to 3 weeks and found that they tended to mimic adults' specific facial expressions and hand movements, which suggests that interactional synchrony is an innate ability to aid the formation of attachments, thus reinforcing the importance of caregiver-infant interactions. However, a methodological issue with the research is that Meltzoff and Moore used a controlled observation when collecting data. A problem with this technique is that it may be prone to biases when the researcher is recording the data. The mother may show demand characteristics to seem like a good mother. This, in fact, would weaken the validity of the data and the support for interactional synchrony. The importance of bodily contact has been highlighted by Klaus and Kennel, who compared mothers who had extended physical contact with their baby in comparison to mothers who only had physical contact during the feeding in the 3 days after birth. After 1 month, they found that mothers who had greater physical contact made greater eye contact and affectionate cuddles with their infant compared to mothers who had lesser physical contact. This suggests that greater physical contact can lead to stronger and closer bond formation, thus increasing the validity of this research. Practical applications for society is one strength of this research. The identification of interactional synchrony as an important foundation in the formation of attachments, high quality attachments, can have practical applications for society. The role of the father. Parent-infant attachment. Traditionally, we have thought in terms of mother-infant attachments. Schaefer and Emerson found that the majority of babies did become attached to their mother first, around 7 months, and within a few weeks or months formed secondary attachments to other family members, including the father. In 75% of the infants studied, an attachment was formed with the father by 18 months. This was determined by the fact that the infants protested when their father walked away, which is a sign of attachment. AO3. Grossman did a longitudinal study. He carried out a longitudinal study in 2002 looking at both parents' behaviour and its relationship to the quality of children's attachments into their teens. The findings showed that the quality of infant attachments with mothers but not fathers was related to children's attachments in adolescence, suggesting that the father attachment was less important. However, the quality of the father's play with the infants was related to the quality of adolescent attachment, which suggests that the fathers have a different role in attachment, one more to do with play and stimulation and less to do with nurturing. A methodological point strength is that it was a longitudinal study. Children were observed into their teen years, and this allowed researchers to collect research that is rich and detailed, as well as being able to observe any changes in the infant's behaviour over a period of time. This increases the validity of the findings as the researchers are able to draw accurate conclusions, thus strengthening the research in the role of the father. However, research into fathers as primary carers. There's some evidence to suggest that when fathers take on the role of being the main caregiver, they adopt behaviours that are more typical of mothers. Field filmed 4-month-old babies in face-to-face interactions with primary caregiver fathers, primary caregiver mothers, and secondary caregiver fathers. Primary caregiver fathers, like mothers, spent more time smiling, imitating, and holding infants than the secondary caregiver fathers. This behaviour appears to be important in building an attachment with the infant. So it seems that fathers can be the more nurturing attachment figure. The key to the attachment relationship is the level of responsiveness and not the gender of the parent. Stages of attachment identified by Schaefer and Emerson. The asocial phase occurs in the first few weeks. In this stage, infants become attracted to other humans, preferring them to objects and events. The second stage is known as the indiscriminate attachment phase, which takes place between 3 to 8 months. During this time, infants begin to discriminate between familiar and unfamiliar people, smiling more at known people. They still allow strangers to handle and look after them. The next stage is known as specific attachment, which takes place from 8 months onwards. Infants begin to develop specific attachment, staying close to particular people and becoming distressed when separated, which is stranger anxiety. The final stage is known as multiple attachment, which can begin as early as 9 months onwards. Within this stage, infants are able to form strong secondary attachments with people other than their primary caregiver, i.e. grandparents. AA3. Supportive evidence comes from a longitudinal study conducted by Schaefer and Emerson. They looked at the relationship between newborn infants and their caregivers for 18 months. Follow-up interviews were also conducted with the caregivers, and attachment was measured based on separation anxiety, which is when the infant is separated from the caregiver, and stranger anxiety, which is the infant's response to strangers. The findings revealed that the majority of infants, 50%, displayed separation anxiety between the ages of 6 to 8 months, and went on to forming multiple attachments at 18 months. These findings correlate with Schaefer and Emerson's stages of attachment and suggest that this process is biologically controlled and innate. However, a methodological issue with the study is that the data was collected by direct observations from the caregivers, which means that the sources could be prone to bias and inaccuracies. Consequently, this would impact the validity of the findings, and it weakens the support that the research has for the stages of attachment. Further criticisms have sparked from the unrepresentative sample that Schaefer and Emerson chose to investigate. The mothers were all from a working class background, which means that sample can be considered as biased as it fails to represent caregivers from all social backgrounds. Child rearing practices can vary depending on families' financial status, and this weakens the population validity of the study as accurate generalizations cannot be drawn, thus limiting its support for the stages of attachment. Carpenter refutes the claim that the indiscriminate phase occurs at 3 to 8 months. He found that when presenting 2-week-old babies with familiar and unfamiliar voices, the babies were able to distinguish the voices and the faces of their caregiver to strangers. This suggests that babies can recognize and are attracted to their mothers from an early age, which contradicts Schaefer and Emerson's belief that initially babies are attracted to any person interacting with them. Animal studies of attachment. Lorenz conducted research into imprinting, a form of attachment where offspring follow the first large moving object that they see. He investigated this by dividing a clutch of gosling eggs into 2 groups. One group was raised by their natural mother, whilst the other lay in an incubator. When the incubator eggs hatched, the first living, moving thing that they saw was Lorenz, and soon they started following him around. Lorenz conducted various tests. One involved placing the naturally hatched goslings with the incubated ones together. He found that when he stood present with the natural mother, the goslings separated themselves, one group following their natural mother and the other group following Lorenz. Lorenz notes that the process of imprinting was restricted within a time frame. This is the first 4 to 24 hours, and he called this the critical period. He also concluded that the process of imprinting is similar to attachment in humans. Other animal research has been conducted by Harlow, who investigated the importance of food, which was previously researched by the learning theory over comfort on infant monkeys. Harlow separated newborn monkeys from their mother and presented them with 2 surrogate mothers. The first was a wild monkey, which supplied the infant monkey with food. The second was a clothed monkey, which provided the infant with comfort. Harlow found that the infant monkey spent the majority of the time on the clothed monkey. It was 22.5 hours on average, and only went to the wild monkey when it was hungry. In situations where the monkeys were frightened, they still sought comfort from the clothed monkey, contradicting claims that attachments are formed solely on food. A major criticism of using animals to investigate human behaviour is that it is difficult to extrapolate the findings, as humans are far more socially and emotionally developed. Thus we have to be cautious when making generalizations, which weakens the validity of such research. A further limitation with using animals in psychological research are the ethical implications. In both Lorenz and Harlow's research, animals were separated from their natural caregiver when they were born and subjected to distress, which resulted in long-term irreversible psychological effects. For example, the monkeys in Harlow's research later grew up to suffer problems when mating and neglected their own offspring. Subsequently, this weakens the appropriateness of using animals in psychological research. Although criticism surround the use of animals for research, the findings from Lorenz's study have helped pioneer other psychological theories to be created. For example, Lorenz proposed that there is a short window in which imprinting could occur. This was taken by John Bowlby, who later proposed that it was vital for children to form their primary attachment between 7 months and 3 years, which is the sensitive period, or there was a risk that an attachment would not be formed at all. This increases the appropriateness of animal research. Harlow's research has had important applications in a range of practical contexts. For example, it has helped social workers understand the risk factors in child neglect and abuse so they are able to intervene to prevent it. It has also helped in the care of captive monkeys and has highlighted the importance of proper attachment figures for baby monkeys in zoos and also breeding programs in the wild. This increases the appropriateness of animal research. The learning theory of attachment. The learning/behavior approach proposes that we are born as a blank slate, and all behavior is learned from the environment. There are two main theories which explain how attachments are formed. Classical conditioning theory states that food is an unconditioned, natural stimulus which produces an unconditioned response of pleasure. It is often the mother who delivers food, so therefore she becomes associated with the feeling of pleasure. The mother has now become a conditioned stimulus and a source of pleasure independent of whether she is supplying food. Operant conditioning theory states that we are more likely to repeat a behaviour if as a result we get a reward, which is positive reinforcement, or if it removes something unpleasant, which is negative reinforcement. Food acts as a negative reinforcement because it takes away the unpleasant feeling of hunger. Attachment is formed as a child learns to associate the caregiver with reducing the unpleasant feeling of hunger, so that the caregiver becomes a source of reinforcement themselves. A limitation with the learning theory is that the research is largely based on studies with animals. Behaviorists believe that humans are no different to animals in terms of behavioral responses to stimuli, and therefore argue that it is legitimate to extrapolate animal behavior to humans. However, many psychologists have refuted this claim by stating that humans are far more complex species and are more intellectually and emotionally developed compared to animals. Therefore, the learning theory has been criticised for lacking validity because of its oversimplified version of human behaviour and the fact that accurate generalisations cannot be drawn. The learning theory has been criticised for suggesting that infants only develop attachments with their caregiver as they supply them with food. A study on monkeys tested this argument by presenting infant monkeys with two surrogate mothers, a wire monkey which could offer only food and a clothed monkey which offered comfort. The findings revealed that on average, 22.5 hours was spent on the clothed monkey in comparison to the wire monkey. This suggests that food is not the sole factor for the formation of attachment, thus weakening the validity and support for the learning theory. A limitation with the study, however, is the lack of ethical consideration, as the monkeys were exposed to high levels of stress. This led the monkeys having difficulties mating and parenting their young, and this reduces the appropriateness of the study as the animals were psychologically harmed, and this weakens Harlow's arguments against the learning theory. An idea point you can use is an alternative explanation such as Bowlby's monotropic theory. Bowlby's monotropic theory. Bowlby proposed that attachment served as an evolutionary function to survive. He suggested that infants are born with innate traits or characteristics called social releases. Examples include crying and looking cute. These traits will attract attention from the caregiver, who will provide protection, shelter and food. Bowlby suggested that there is a critical period, which is 7 months to 3 years, which to form an attachment. If a child does not form an attachment during this window, then the child may find it difficult to form attachments in later life. Bowlby believed that there is an innate bias towards one individual, forming the primary attachment, which is called monotropy. We form this special attachment with the person who is most responsive to us, which is usually the mother. This attachment provides us with a template on which to base our future relationships on, and this is the internal working model. Bailey et al. Supportive evidence for the internal working model. Bailey et al. Looked at 99 mothers with 1-year-old babies and assessed the quality of the attachment to their own mothers using a standard interview procedure. The findings showed that children with insecure attachments had mothers who had insecure attachments with their mothers. This suggests that the legacy of insecure attachments were being passed on from generations to generation, and this increases the validity of the theory. However, this was a self-report technique, which means that there could be social desirability. Parents may have presented themselves in a more positive light with the fear of being seen as a bad parent, which reduces the validity and the support for this research. Conflicting evidence against the critical period comes from Rutter et al. It's been debated whether a specific time frame exists in which an attachment can form. Research by Rutter et al. Found conflicting evidence to whether the critical period can be extended. Research on children raised in institutions and who were adopted after the optimum age Bowlby suggested. The findings revealed that the children were able to form secure attachments with their adoptive parents. This suggests that the critical period can be extended with the right kind of care, thus increasing Bowlby's argument that there is a cut-off point in the formation of attachments. However, a weakness of this research is that it is historically biased. It was carried out over 10 years ago, which reduces its validity as it's outdated information, as it fails to consider the advanced changes that have been made to institutional care, and this limits its case against Bowlby's theory. And an alternative explanation that you can use is the learning theory of attachment. The strange situation. Mary Ainsworth studied attachment types in infants and their caregivers. She used 26 American mothers and child pairs and used a controlled observation that focused on certain areas to assess attachment types of children. Exploration was how the infant explored their environment. Separation anxiety was how the child reacted when the caregiver left the room. Stranger anxiety was their reaction when a stranger interacted, and reunion behaviour was their behaviour towards the caregiver once she arrived. There were 7 episodes, each of which lasted 3 minutes. Findings. The secure attachment was the most common at 66%. Children with a secure attachment explored their environment and used their caregiver as a safe base. They were subdued when the caregiver left, and they were wary if approached by a stranger. They were easily comforted at reunion. Insecure avoidant children were indifferent to the caregiver leaving and returning. They were apathetic by the stranger's interactions and avoided caregiver at reunion. Insecure resistant at 12% were reluctant to explore their environment and extremely distressed when caregiver left the room. They behaved ambivalent towards strangers and displayed both seeking and rejecting behaviours at reunion. AA3. A weakness of this research is that it was conducted in an artificial environment. The mother and the stranger were acting to a script. The study thus lacks ecological validity, and the strange situation is considered to be far from an everyday situation. It would have been more appropriate to have conducted the observation in the child's natural environment, and this consequently weakens the research into attachment types. A strength of this research is that it has been replicated in other countries to see if similar results would be found. Van Eisendoen and Kronenberg did a meta-analysis of 32 strange situations in 8 countries. They found findings parallel to those found in Ainsworth's study. Secure was most common at 67%, insecure avoidant at 21%, and insecure resistant at 12%. This increases the reliability as it is consistent across other cultures. However, ethical issues of participant harm is another limitation. The infants were deliberately subjected to high levels of distress when separated from their mothers. However, this can also be seen as justifiable because the distress caused is no greater than that of everyday experience, for example, being left alone with an unfamiliar childminder. Another weakness is that it is culture bound, so it risks imposing ethic. Takahashi did a study and found cultural differences in childhood experiences, which are likely to mean children respond differently to strange situations. Takahashi notes that the test doesn't really work in Japan. It's a Japanese norm for mothers to not leave their children for the first 2 years. This means that there were high levels of separation anxiety, and at reunion stage, mothers would run to the baby and scoop them up, which means that the child's response was hard to observe. This reduces the generalizability and the validity, as it may risk imposing ethic. Cultural variations. Research by Van Eigenduen and Cronenberg, they did a meta-analysis of 32 strange situations observations in 8 different countries. Their findings were secure was the most common at 67%, insecure avoidant at 21%, and insecure resistant at 12%. The findings also revealed huge differences in the percentages of insecure attachments within cultures, which is intra-cultures. The findings suggest that the variations were due to different child-rearing practices adopted by families. However, despite the differences, the cultural similarities indicate that secure attachment was still the most common type of attachment, which supports the view that attachment is an innate and biological process. A methodological criticism is that they used a meta-analysis. Findings examined may be prone to inaccuracies due to factors such as lack of control of variables. This can reduce the validity and weakens its use to explain cultural differences in attachment types. Evidence to support that variations in cultures exist. So a study was conducted on Japanese infants by Takahashi. Infants scored high on insecure resistant when placed in the strange situation. Findings can be explained due to norms and expectations adopted in Japan. Caregivers were expected to stay with the child during the first 2 years of their life and are rarely separated. This can explain the extreme levels of distress during separation anxiety, and findings thus weaken the strange situation as an accurate and universal measure of attachment type, thus reducing the validity but increasing the support of Van Eigenduen and Cronenberg's study. A weakness of Takahashi's study is that it was sample bias. All infants were from middle-class backgrounds and were reared at home. Thus, accurate generalizations cannot be made across the population, as findings may have been different if they had used a different range of children. This weakens the population validity of the study and its support. Another limitation is that the method of assessment was biased and it imposes ethic. The strange situation was designed by an American researcher, Ainsworth, and based on a British theory, Bowlby. There's question over whether Anglo-American theories and assessments can be applied to other cultures, as it risks imposing ethic, and instead of a lack of separation anxiety and a lack of pleasure on reunion indicating an insecure attachment, in Germany this behaviour might be seen as more independence than avoidance, hence not a sign of insecurity within that cultural context. Bowlby's MDH, maternal deprivation hypothesis. Bowlby proposed that disruptions to an attachment bond, even short-term disruptions, could result in serious and permanent damage to a child's emotional, social, and intellectual development. He called this maternal deprivation hypothesis. Intellectual development involved mental retardation characterized by an abnormally low IQ. Extreme cases of MDH could lead infants to become an affectionless psychopath. This is the inability to experience guilt or strong emotions for others. Bowlby stressed the importance of the critical period for a child's psychological development. If a child was separated from their mother within that time frame for an extended period of time, psychological damage was inevitable without an adequate replacement figure. Evidence to support the link between affectionless psychopathy and MDH. Bowlby studied 44 delinquent teenagers accused of stealing. He also interviewed the families of those who'd been accused, and the findings revealed that all the thieves displayed signs of affectionless psychopathy, i.e. lacking affection and guilt. 14 out of 44 were described as affectionless psychopaths. Of these, 12 had experienced prolonged separation from primary caregivers in the first 2 years of their life. Findings support Bowlby's MDH and the importance of the critical period, and that disruptions within that time frame can cause affectionless psychopathy to occur. A limitation of this research, however, is much of the evidence for MDH is based on correlational data. Thus, it's difficult to establish cause and effect conclusions between separation and emotional and behavioural difficulties. Other factors could be contributing to the findings of the 44 Thieves study, such as peer influence, dispositional characteristics, i.e. personality. This weakens the validity of the research and the support for MDH. A further limitation is Bowlby failed to distinguish the difference between deprivation and privation. Russett et al. Distinguished between deprivation and privation. He argues that severe long-term damage that Bowlby associated with deprivation actually is more likely to be a result of privation. Many of the 44 thieves investigated by Bowlby had moved from home to home during childhood, so never formed attachments in the first place. This weakens the validity of MDH as the cause of affectionate psychopathy, as it may be due may not be due to deprivation as Bowlby believes it to be. IDA, so this is an example of alpha bias, an emphasis that the psychological development for babies and toddlers is dependent on mother's presence in child's life makes this research socially sensitive. It puts pressure on women who wish to return back to work, as they may fear that their child may become a criminal or an affectionless psychopath as a result of their decision. This reduces the appropriateness of such research. Institutionalization, Romanian orphans. Institutional care is childcare provided by orphanages and children's homes. Bowlby said that children who've been raised in institutions are likely to suffer from a mixture of deprivation and privation. This is a loss of attachment. He also proposed that these infants are also likely to show a distinctive attachment behaviour known as disinhibited attachment. This type of attachment includes behaviours such as cling and attention seeking. Further effects of institutionalization include delayed intellectual development or low IQ or problems with concentration, disinhibited attachment, emotional development such as like experiencing more temper tantrums, and lack of internal working model. AA3. Russett et al. Investigated the effects of institutional care. He looked at whether the effects of institutional care and privation could be reversed through an enriching environment. He conducted a longitudinal study and followed 165 Romanian orphans that were adopted either at the ages of 6 months, between 6 to 12 months, and after 2 years. The findings revealed that prior to adoption, the 50% of the Romanian orphans had cognitive dysfunctions. However, after being adopted at the age of 4, orphans showed significant improvement in both cognitive and physical development. This suggests that the negative effects of institutionalization can be reversed through sensitive and high quality care. A methodological strength of this research is that it was a longitudinal study. Although the practical factors such as waiting a long time to see the results, etc., the benefits are large. It enables researchers to collect rich, detailed data and also enables researchers to record the changes that have occurred over time. This strengthens the validity of the findings and its support for institutional care. A further weakness is it fails to consider individual differences. Some children who failed to make an attachment within the sensitive period showed little problems compared to others. Consequently weakens validity of the study and its contribution for institutional care. However, Rutter has suggested that these differences were because those children who received special attention in the institution. Practical applications. This research has led to the improvement of the way that children are cared for in children's homes. They now avoid having large numbers of caregivers for each child. There are one or two key workers who play a central role, and this allows children to develop normal attachments and avoid disinhibited attachments. This increases the appropriateness of research into institutional care. Influence of early attachment. Bowlby suggested that a child's primary attachment figure was the blueprint for subsequent relationships in their life. The continuity hypothesis suggests that a child's attachment types can be reflected in their later adult relationships. The concept also ties in with the internal working model, which states that an infant's primary attachment forms the template for future relationships, i.e. romantic relationships as well as relationships with their own children. Supportive evidence to link between attachment style and later adult relationships. Hazard and Shaver published a love quiz in an American newspaper which recorded people's early attachment experiences and current romantic attitudes and experiences. They found that people who were securely attached as infants tended to have happy and long-lasting love relationships in adulthood. Insecure types found adult relationships more difficult and felt that true love was rare. This suggests that our early experiences can influence our later relationships, which strengthens the validity of Bowlby's idea of the internal working model. However, a methodological issue is that it used a self-report technique. So self-report techniques, answers that participants provided may be biased in some way to make them look more desirable, which is social desirability bias. Findings and associations made by Hazard and Shaver may be invalid and cannot provide a true reflection of the rest of society. This weakens the support that childhood development can influence adult relationships. A further weakness is that it relies heavily on retrospective data. So many of the studies conducted in this area rely heavily on retrospective data, whereby participants must recall experiences from childhood, meaning memories recalled on childhood experiences are likely to be not be completely accurate due to memory decay, etc. This can weaken the validity of the data obtained, as well as limiting the support for childhood influencing adult relationships. IDA, is it too deterministic? Are we sealing the fate of individuals who have had poor upbringing and saying that they'll definitely have poor relationships in the future? One issue that's been raised as a result of these studies indicate that early experiences have a fixed influence on later adult relationships. This concept is too deterministic. It suggests that children who are insecurely attached in childhood will ultimately experience emotionally unsatisfying relationships as adults. However, this isn't the case, as Hazan found that relationship breakups were associated with a shift from secure to insecure attachment. This would suggest that our attachment type is determined by nurture rather than nature, as it changes depending on our circumstances and our environment. This weakens the appropriateness of research into childhood influencing adult relationships. The end.